Oh, she's got such a nice voice. John, have you read the letter of consent that we sent, and do you agree with its terms and conditions?
Yes, and I sent you in a signed copy.
Perfect. Laurel, have you also read it, and do you agree with its terms and conditions?
I have, thanks.
Good. And with that, I'm not quite sure how you want to start, Laurel or John, but would you introduce first yourself and tell us, briefly your background that got you into the situation where you became in contact with the SACTU Solidarity Committee?
John, do you want to start?
Well, okay. Well, I can't. I was just trying to think of when the first time we met, but anyway, my background in the labor movement is that I was first the assistant to Kent Rowley, who was Secretary Treasurer of the Confederation of Canadian Unions. And when did I start that? Around 1972 or 73. And when Kent died in 1978, I was elected to replace him as the Secretary Treasurer. And so I held that position until 1992. And I think, just to briefly, most of the major unions in the CCU, after a long debate, decided to merge with the CAW, which had become a Canadian union. And I supported that, although it meant I was, I then didn't run again for Secretary Treasurer when most of the unions came off. CTCU, CASA, a number of others merged with the CAW. And so then I was out of work and I went to law school and got a law degree, and then got hired by the CAW, both in the summer as a student, and then afterwards, when I graduated, I got hired as in the legal department of the CAW, and then I worked there at the CAW until I guess 1993, when I retired from the CAW. Involvement in SACTU. I mean, SACTU was just always there. I don't know when you guys started organizing, but in terms of the CCU, I think it's fair to say that there was certainly an open door for SACTU. I mean, like, we supported the principles. We provided what finances that we could, and we also, I think, in terms of my work, kind of assisted to open the doors to our affiliated unions, who, in terms of the CCU structure, had more money to contribute. The CCU did contribute money, but we operated on a very slim budget. Ken Lockhart, Ken Traynor, Jane less so, I don't remember, but attended many CCU conventions, executive board meetings, similarly the conventions of our affiliated unions, and even like educational programs. We're regular speakers, and I think the whole struggle of SACTU was something that the CCU as a central labor body, but most of our affiliates were very active in, and did the work that was needed, in publicizing that. And I have one story that I want to relate, which I'm not even sure. I would like to get it kind of documented. But anyway, I'll get into that.
Sure. Let's meet Laurel as well then at early on in this recording.
Right.
And if I could ask one of you to also, just for those less young and less informed people who are going to be reading this, could you just give us some background on the CCU itself? What does it mean, and where did it come from?
Right. I think John's the most appropriate person to talk about the CCU in general. I worked within the CCU as an organizer and then an officer with the Canadian Textile and Chemical Union. The Confederation of Canadian Unions, the CCU, was the umbrella organization, and it was on the outs for some considerable period of time with the Canadian Labour Congress. And again, maybe John can talk about that. I came on as not long after high school as an organizer with the Canadian Textile and Chemical Union in 1972. And I later became an officer and worked there until 1992 when the CTCU joined Canadian Auto Workers. I had also been active in anti-poverty organizations and very considerably in the feminist movement, particularly the National Action Committee on the Status of Women. And I think that's another piece of the history that might be linked in at some point in terms of the support for the anti-apartheid work. I think I don't recall the first time that I encountered the SACTU organizers. What I do remember as my earliest memory, and this would have been in the second half of the 1970s. So I was still in my 20s, and while not a newbie to activism, this experience really stuck with me. And this was in the basement of the very dark and dank, somewhat dank basement of the Bricklayers and Masons Union, one of the affiliates of the CCU. And I don't even recall who made the presentation, but both Kent Rowley and Madeline Perrant were present. So this is, Kent died in the late 1980s. So this was, late 1970s. So this might have been, I'm guessing 76 or something like that. And a presentation was made. And there was, and again, I don't recall whether it was a film or a poster or photographs, but I do remember it was visual in part. And I was for the first time introduced to a man named Nelson Mandela, who I'd never heard of. And it became very quickly clear that this was very risky business. This was dangerous stuff that people were involved with. This was a man that was at that time considered, and it's in as I recall, Rob Anders, well into the next millennium, considered a terrorist. And the stories of what I in my Torontonian world considered stories of people living in terrible slums, the stories of the pass laws and the body searches that people experienced leaving the diamond mines, just unthinkable for me in my world, in unthinkable indignities and terrible hardships. And I think probably the most, the counterpart to this in some ways, in my experience, was helping with the grape boycott work. I mean, it was not central work for me, but as many in my broader community did, I was engaged, although I did visit the California headquarters at one point. But this seemed much more clandestine, much more difficult in some ways. It really shook me up. I realized that it would take great bravery to do this work, and that extended to people who were doing the support work. When this presentation was made, I know I was not the only one in the room who was hearing this for the first time. And again, it was a very dark little basement boardroom, very small. And there was maybe, if luck had it, maybe 20 people present. And I know I was not the only one. And again mattered enormously that both Madeleine Perrant and Kent Rowley spoke up to endorse this campaign and to calm any nerves that people might have about getting involved with something where there was somebody labeled a terrorist as one of the leaders, although behind bars. It wasn't soon after. I'll just finish this part, but it wasn't soon after that I came to see this as for me, one of the proudest moments of the Confederation of Canadian Unions, the CCU, because the rest of the labor movement was not there at the time. And that's another interesting thing that I hope we would talk about at some point, because it's always seemed to me that there was maybe not, definitely not by design, probably more by necessity. There's an interesting study that somebody could do about the role of the Confederation of Canadian Unions in Canada, the role of SACTU in the South African struggles, and at another point, the FAT in Mexico. These are all unions that were not the central labor body, but were absolutely instrumental in moving this forward. And I say that as, still a proud member of CAW Unifor, whatever the warts are of all these organizations. But that role, that critical role is worth understanding, not just as a historical footnote, but as maybe something that provides some lessons about how we approach our work in the present day.
Wow, thanks so much. What a tremendous intro. So back to you, John, if you would do a little more background on the CCU, and then we can start that SACTU side a little more thoroughly.
Well, I try to do a thumbnail sketch. CCU was founded in 1968. It was originally called the Council of Canadian Unions and changed its name to Confederation of Canadian Unions. I believe it was 1972 or 73. The main driving force behind the formation of the CCU was first Kent Rowley and then Madeleine Perrant. They worked as a team. Their history was that they had organized tens of thousands of textile workers in Quebec and had the union pulled out from under them from, corrupt gangster style heads of the American unions. They had organized into the American Union, and they were turfed out and left with nothing. It was the Red Scare days, and all of that was behind them. And they managed to maintain, really, it was one local at Harding's Carpets in Brantford. And so Kent particularly moved to Brantford, and then later Madeleine, and they maintained their organization with the Harding Carpets plant and a few other plants that they had organized, a handful of them. But Kent had always, I mean, based on his experience, they knew full well the '50s to get some of the unions that had been turfed out of the Congress of Canadian Unions at that time to form a central labor body. Mine Mill, United Electrical Workers, the more progressive unions in the countries, you know, the CLC always labeled them as communist-dominated unions, which is, well, that's a whole, complicated story to parse exactly what that means. But anyway, they failed to get, because even within the, the left-wing leadership of the unions, they were all into, their main thing was to get, back into the CLC. That was their objective. So anyway, but things were building in the country. There were a lot of breakaways, resistance to American unions. And so it was 1968 that Kent called together there'd be half a dozen unions: Pulp and Paper Workers in British Columbia, CAW, which had just been formed, CTCU, bricklayers had broken away in Toronto and formed their own union, the Canadian Union of Operating Engineers. I may be missing a couple of others. Anyway, they formed the Council of Canadian Unions, and then as I said, became the Confederation of Canadian Unions a few years later. So the CCU, I mean, we ended up building an organization. There are about 15 unions in the CCU at my time, but we were spread out across the country, obviously quite thin. Our total membership was never exceeded much beyond 40,000. So in terms of numbers in the labor movement, we were quite small, but we were stressing the need that Canadian workers needed their Canadian unions, and publicizing when. Well, I suppose what we also have to add is that in terms of our approach to unionism, we had a more militant brand of unionism that was more, how can I put it? That was, well, in a way, anti-capitalist would be, I think, a good way of putting it, and that was always part of our program. So that was yeah. So we were thinly spread, but we were across the country. We had oil workers in Montreal, the east end of Montreal, the big refineries, 3 or 4 of the big refineries. They weren't all organized. In Ontario, we had the Canadian Textile and Chemical Union, Operating Engineers, the bricklayers, but it was out west, particularly in British Columbia, with the work of CAW, and the CAW stands for Canadian Association of Industrial, Mechanical and Allied Workers. Pulp and Paper Workers of Canada. Pulp and Paper Workers represented half the workers, pulp workers in BC. CAW organized in the heavy industry that exists in truck plants in Vancouver, in the Vancouver area, but also in the mines. And I don't know at the height, I would expect CAW represented almost half the mines in British Columbia. So in BC, the CCU had a much more of a foothold in the major industries in the province. And so for that reason, I think we were all, we were paid more attention to. And there was also CASA up in Kitimat. Well, I don't want to forget CASA, which had a spectacular victory over the steel workers, which Kent Rowley was, was up there involved in that, and so I forget what the numbers were, but it was like of 2,000 workers, and I think it was about 1,700 to 300 when the vote came for CASA. And so this was a stunning, this shook the leaders of the Canadian Labour Congress, the extent of that victory. Anyway, so that's I think gives you an outline of the CCU.
Well, absolutely brilliant, and it also shows very clearly why there would be such a natural affinity between SAC2 Solidarity and you folks. You were pushing the limits, and you were pushing an anti-capitalist, pro-labor line.
And outsiders, you know, we were like, you know, I think what Laurell was saying, looking at these labor movements where the unions outside the mainstream had a significant effect on the direction of the labor movement.
There's two sides to that. Sorry.
Carry on.
Okay. Yeah.
Please go ahead.
I was going to say that there's two sides to that. Yes, we maintained a different approach to everything from organizing to political work. At the same time, we also worked with the very good people that were in a lot of these other unions. And one of the sort of genius parts of the organizing that was done by SAC2 Solidarity was, somebody like Ken and Jane, and there were others who would bring us these lists. You really brilliant organizing, second to none. They would bring us these lists and say, look, we need to find somebody. We need to find an entry point to discuss this, because we think there would be support from the membership if they understood in this union or that union. And do you know, folks, are there people you work with, maybe on health and safety, maybe on women's work, a variety of other scores? And do you know good people in those organizations that we might reach out to and begin our work in that union? So, yes, we were on the outside, but we were also, it's both a comment on the role of, the organization, the CCU and its affiliates, and also the astute organizing tactics by the organizers within the SAC2 Solidarity Committee. And they used those connections that we did have, because there were good people in a lot of those organizations. There were unions that stand out from the rest. Postal workers, et cetera, that we didn't even make any introductions. But in some of the more business union, some of the more business-oriented American unions, they really needed some contacts, and we had them.
Mm-hmm. Tremendous. I think, Ken or Jane, here's a good point for you now to bring up the connections and get feedback from our friends.
I'll jump in and start. The first formal meeting between the SAC2 committee and the CCU in my history, my memory, was that we set up our committee in May of 1980 with the mandate of SAC2 to represent them in Canada. One of our first kind of occasions was being invited to set up a book table at the CCU convention or meetings in Montreal. This is where I met some of the people we're talking to today. I had also personally, I have certain affinities to the CCU because I had done academic research in British Columbia back in the early 70s. So people like Angus McPhee and others from the PPWC were friends. I knew them. So here we come back from Africa with our book. So setting up a book table at a CCU convention or a meeting was quite important to establishing that initial connection with John, Laurel, Madeline, etc. So that's kind of it's 1980 was the beginning of that relationship in my memory.
Does that you, Jane?
Yes, just to echo both John and Laurel, I've been searching as best I can archives to try and find union references to South Africa, anti-apartheid SACTU, and found the first, I think, resolution endorsing endorsing SACTU and endorsing working with the SACTU Solidarity Committee from a 1981 convention of the CCU. I can't remember whether it was Montreal or Winnipeg that convention was in, but you know, trying to track down some of the details of this history has been important in the last 6 months. But I think you were the first. We do know that we met with Bob White and with Jean-Claude Perrault early on in 1980-81, and they were solid from then on. But I think yours was the first convention.
Yeah.
Okay. The number of issues that come up are well, not issues so much as can we talk a little bit more about the way SACTU then went into these various places, SACTU Solidarity Committee, and how that response, you said a little finance, but I understand that even these resolutions can be an accomplishment because it has to go from the local, you have to have those debates, and then they have to come to the floor. Could we just get into that mechanics a little bit to explore this solidarity that was between the two?
Well, yeah, I think I can. What comes to mind immediately in response to that is that I mean, Jane and Ken can, confirm this. Is that, but my sense of the support that we could give was that by passing a strong resolution in the CCU, then, and make this public, a resolution of support, then that sort of, put the fire to the feet of some of the, more, less enthusiastic leaders in the CLC. Now, there were some leaders like Bob White, Jean-Claude Perrault, they were, on board and saw that they didn't need any support, but there were others. And I think that was one of the ways of, that the CCU could give support that went beyond its numbers or its financial resources. But there was another thing, and I want to tell this story, I guess I would like it now sort of documented better, and maybe Ken, you'll recall some of this. This story comes from Jim Nyland, who was one of the officers at CAW in Kitimat. I can't put a date on it, but I would put this was kind of well on into, so if we're thinking starting at 1980, this would be probably the end of the 80s. Ken had gone up to Kitimat to give a talk at. He brought lots of materials about Alcan's investment and activities in South Africa, and so CAW was in negotiations at this time. They're in the kind of the final stages of their contract negotiations. And to understand the picture there, as Jim Nyland had told me, that you could never negotiate with CAW about how much money they were making, and then they just never, they would say, yeah, we make lots of money. We could pay you all $100 an hour, but we're not going to. What we'll do is follow the pattern in the industry. And employers can do that. So they were, their wages were really, controlled by the wages in the woods industry and whatnot. You try to make your breakthroughs. And of course, there's sitting at a negotiating table, you can get pretty pissed off at that kind of arrogance of the company that they're not really dealing with, the argument. So they went in, they brought in one of the top executives from Montreal to finalize the negotiations. And I don't know if they actually put on the table that they wanted a clause in the collective agreement that Alcan had to withdraw from South Africa, but they did something like that they got on the agenda, Alcan's involvement in South Africa, and then bombarded them for a whole day with all of the information that Ken had provided a week before or something. And they had a great time doing it, because, it was, and they said that certainly this guy from Montreal and also their own, bosses were kind of quite taken aback at how knowledgeable they were about what was going on in South Africa. And so I and sometimes I have to say that in the telling of these stories, they may get embellished a little bit, but there's certainly a kernel of truth to this. And it just strikes me as a kind of almost perfect example of how like solidarity works. I mean, here was, the preliminary work of building bonds with the Sac2 Solidarity Committee, Ken and Jane and Brenda and Ken Trainer, we can't forget, so that we knew each other, we were friends, got this information and used this to don't know what to say. Well, I was going to say embarrassed, but make very uncomfortable the executives of Alcan. I don't know if it ever had any effect. But in some ways, stuff like this, has an impact that you may never realize. I mean, I wouldn't claim that, that Alcan changed their minds about investing $1 in South Africa as a result of this, but I think it's still a great story and would hope it gets recorded.
It's absolutely amazing. It's an exceptional access to management that otherwise they would ignore it in the media, they would ignore the people ticketing out front of their offices, and certainly they have no interest in hearing it. And there you guys are right at the table looking the senior guys in the eyes and telling them their stuff smells, So
I want to know, Ken, if Jim Nyland had ever told you about this, or if you'd heard it from any of the other people.
I had heard the story, and mentioning of Kitimat and CASO brings back a lot of those memories of the early Sac2 work. In 1981, the first official tour with the Sac2 Solidarity Committee by Sac2 executive member Zola Zembe, we went to the Northwest. We did Prince Rupert, the pulp workers, Terrace, the Labor Council under the direction of John Jensen, who was with the Carpenters Union, one of those lefties in the CLC. And then we went to CASO in Kitimat. And I remember traveling from Terrace to Kitimat with Zola, who was absolutely shocked at the trees that had been denuded from the mountainside.
Shelter, yeah.
The clearing of trees for the pulp industry. And Zola was just amazed and astonished and offended by the fact that the environment had been so destroyed. And this is before we were talking about environmental issues, but that's the politics of South Africa. So we go to the meeting in CASO. It was a small meeting. It was a local union meeting. And we met amongst others. I mean, I think Jim may have been there at that meeting. And I do remember him very well. But also at that meeting was a young, at that time, Black brother named Brian O'Hyman, who later became very important in the work in Toronto with OPSEU. But he was from Jamaica, I believe, and was an activist within the CASO local. And he and Zola hit it off immediately, and they went off and had good chats with each other after the meeting ended. But Brian became then an activist in the jail system in Toronto, where he would get, believe this or not, inmates to refuse to eat South African fruit that had been brought in by the system to feed workers, prisoners. So Brian was quite instrumental, and Brenda Wall would be able to tell you more stories about Brian being an OPSEU activist at that time. But that CASA meeting was critical. And yes, John, that's the story I do remember. Again, documentation is a little bit thin, but I do remember the story. And also, Alcan then became a target back here in Eastern Canada by the Task Force on Churches and Corporate Responsibility, who were targeting major corporations that were investing in South Africa. So those people were picking up on some of the research that Ken Trainer had done to help them make the same argument against the corporation in a more direct fashion than someplace in Kitimat. So there's a lot of stories here. And while I'm on a roll here, if I'm on a roll, the story I want to tell, John, is that when you arranged for me to go with you to Sudbury to speak to one of the anniversary conventions of Mine Mill, I forget which anniversary it was, 50th, 75th, 90th.
I think it was 100. I think it was 100.
Okay, so
Yeah.
we were allowed, we were invited to speak about South Africa to the 100th anniversary of Mine Mill. Now, this is quite important because Mine Mill, long before the CCU politics came into play, Mine Mill is documented to have on this way back in the 50s and 60s. And this is documented in our book, Organize or Starve. So we're talking about a union and a confederation that has politics that go beyond the CLC politics at that time as an organization. And I think that's one of the key themes to this discussion we're having with the two of you, as well as had with Jeff Keithley last week. The international solidarity work of the CCU, in my view, is different than the international solidarity work of the CLC at that time, because CCU affiliates brought their politics already with them, for the most part. PPWC, CASA, wherever you went. The CLC didn't have those politics for the most part, certainly not at the top. But more important than that, the CLC had to run its international politics through yet an even higher international body, which the CCU didn't have to do. CCU didn't have an affiliation to the ICFTU as the CLC did. So the politics of internationalism were very different between the CCU and the CLC. And even though people like White and Perot bucked the system within the CLC, that didn't mean that the CLC was easy to crack. And we had our struggles with, as everyone knows, for many years. But the distinction between CCU politics, call them anti-capitalist, CLC called them communists, I don't care what you call them. The politics are different in international solidarity. All you had to do was take that list to the union, as Laurel was saying, show them what the connections are. And I'll tell another story later about the pulp sector, but that's kind of the way I see the whole CCU versus CLC issue.
If I could just add, I mean, you've talked about the early resolution, Jane, and Ken, you've referred us back even farther to Mine Mill as an affiliate where they stood years, if not decades before. There was a mix. Sometimes the CCU led openly, like that resolution. I mean, it wasn't the only organization, but an important one with Alcan trying to use bargaining power with an employer to move an employer. And that was all that was all kind of advertised. You would use that then as SACDU Solidarity Committee to move others to do something comparable. There were other times when you would approach us and say, will we have your support? And there'd be discussions and I mean, normally the answer would be yes. You would keep that in your back pocket. You would know when the appropriate time came that you would add the name of the CCU or one of the affiliates. But sometimes if you were a sense shaming some of these organizations into taking action, it didn't help your cause to say that the CCU was already there. So you just keep us in your back pocket. And so again, a very, to my mind, such sophisticated strategy, you know, and tactics anyways, in developing that support, very sophisticated, and a mix of these things. And I'm so glad that somebody mentioned Zola Zembe, because and I know, you know, his name is Archie, but we knew him as Zola Zembe. And, you know, we met other representatives of SACTU along the way, and they were great, each of them in their own way. Zola was a giant, and he was a man of such depth that no one could doubt the honesty and truth of and the gravitas of what he was saying. So I've always wanted a moment to just say that he made a huge difference, and I hope the activists in South Africa know that, and certainly when Canada recognize that. It was a huge difference that he made his way here.
So they're still alive?
No.
Yeah. No, he would have passed away, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I agree with Laurel. Zola made a big impression on me. Well, he was just so legitimate, right? I mean, so we all. I have another story, if you, because you did say that you were looking at stories. Well, this ties in. I was prompted from your letter, Doug, saying, you know, that you didn't want Harper, you know, being, you know, kind of getting the credit and whatnot, you know, like him going over for Mandela's, well, whatever it was that he was there for. So it had a similar thing, and we've already mentioned, I mean, this sort of tension within the CCU and the CLC. One brush, because there were differences, and there were some leaders in there who were very good. But Ken mentioned that at the time, also, like the head of the CLC's International Affairs Department, Harper, was really, you know, anti-SACTU and anti-everything. I mean, and like for someone in that position, his policies were way out of sync with the membership of the CLC, and maybe even with the leadership of the CLC. But he carried a lot of weight. And I don't know if you've been familiar, Doug, if you've seen the article that was in this magazine by Marv Gandil.
Yes, and I've been trying to locate a fresh copy because mine was on fax paper, that old fax paper you talked about, and it's turned.
Well, I kept, you know, I was also, I think, as I mentioned, on the board, the editorial board of this magazine, and I've kept all of the issues of this magazine, except that one, which I've probably pulled out. I went to check it, and it's not there. I got the subsequent one with the letters, you know, from Harper and Paul Purett and Andrew Jackson, who were, you know, responding to it. Anyway, that's I wanted to reread that article because it was a very good analysis of the role of the CLC. So anyway, my story is that when Nelson Mandela came to Toronto, was it 2001? This is his first visit to Toronto. Went to Ottawa and then came to Toronto. His first visit to Canada. 1991, right? So the CLC had arranged for I think, convention center, or one of the hotels, they had a conference room for all the CLC leadership to meet with Mandela. And so Klaus Mueller, who was also one of the longtime activists from CASA in Kitimat, for some reason he was in Toronto. There must have been in conjunction with the CCU meeting. Anyway, he was in the office, and I knew this was, and so I said, Klaus, let's go down, okay? And Mandela's going, oh, sure, okay. So we went down. We go to the door of the meeting hall and say who we are. Say no, you can't come in. And I said, well, we've been no, just for CLC. No, you can't come in. So I said, oh, okay. So we stood outside. We waited outside. Of course, we could see through the doors. And one of the things that the main thing of this meeting, Mandela, I guess, gave a short speech, but all of these labor leaders paraded up. They had a camera and they took a picture with Mandela, and I saw all of these guys going up, and like I'm shaking my head because I mean, they're all supportive of Mandela now, but I knew all the effort that had to go into getting them to do anything. And some of them had never done anything, even with all of the work of, Ken and Jane and Brenda. So anyway, so they're walking out. I'm standing by the door, and Klaus and I are standing there together. And Mandela comes out, and a few steps behind him, and I looked him in the eye and sort of, nodded. A few steps behind him was the SAC2 rep from South Africa at that time. I forget, his nickname was Sticks. He was the one asked to be there. What was his name? I can't.
Oh, I have it somewhere, but I only ever knew him as Sticks.
Anga was the nom de guerre that he used, and it took me about 3 months to find his real name this fall. But yes. Okay.
Anyway, Sticks was there and sort of gave me this sheepish, little look. I didn't know him that well, but he sort of knew who we were, and so Mandela walked by, and that was the recognition that the CCU got for our work. But it was kind of this thing of, all of these people going up to get the picture with Mandela who had, not, well, a lot of them, I'm not saying all of them deserved the picture with Mandela, but a lot of them hadn't done very much. So this is a way of a story to sort of put the history in its proper perspective,
Absolutely.
Anyway, and that also links. It's kind of interesting that it was Klaus from CASA, because there weren't very many times, Klaus was in our office in Toronto, but he just happened to be there, and I said, let's go, and he was, so CASA also got its, kind of recognition from Mandela in a sort of a way, Anyway.
That's a great story, John. Jane, you wanted to say something earlier, go ahead.
Just going back to your comments about Zola, you may not be aware that Zola published an autobiography, and there is one chapter dedicated to the Canadian connection. And I think at one point he says in it, he felt like Canada was his second home. So his autobiography was published by the University of Natal in 1996. But then OPSU in 2011 reprinted a second edition, including a new preface from Zola about the Canadians' work and their support and the solidarity. So there was this mutual thing that developed. He was back and forth many times during the 80s while we were operating, but then he came back in 1996, and again in 2000. He actually came for a holiday with his wife in, I think it was 96. So there was a strong connection and a strong appreciation for what we did in the face of difficult opposition from the CLC, but managed to conquer that. And just on your point with Harker, there were things we knew and had seen evidence of, but then more recently have just read a section in a book by Yves Engler, who's a progressive academic in Canada. And he's tracked down connections between CEDA funding the International Affairs Department of the CLC to such an extent that I think half the staff would have been gone if it hadn't been for CEDA. But of course, there was a quid pro quo. Harker came out of Foreign Affairs as well, as we know. And he has tracked that projects that the CLC was supporting in its so-called support for unions in South Africa had to be approved by the Canadian Embassy in South Africa, such that they could not be connected to political unionism, i.e. any unions that were working with either the ANC or SACTU underground. I'm hoping to find out more about where he found that documentation, because where there's a thread, you just start pulling and you can find more. But
Doug, I think you should have a full show on John Harker.
I
He,
hope
he was really bad. Like he was beyond the pale.
Absolutely.
Pardon?
Laurel?
Yeah, it's like it's so this wasn't just international labor organizations that they were answerable to. No, I'm sure you've covered this elsewhere, but I do want to come back to a couple of points. Just one, the point about these unions that or these union umbrella organizations that operated often on the margins. And I just, in the case of SACTU, it's like so many people don't realize that it wasn't just, a broadly speaking, a political difference with the mainstream unions, but that it was, a non-racialized union central, and I know it's like, comes second nature to people involved in that movement, that, but I think a lot of people forget the leadership of SACTU in that, and these days, looking back, it's hard to believe that there was such a time, but there was. The other thing I want to just make sure it gets covered, if not now, at some point, is I really would like to talk about the women's piece of all of this, and I dug this one up.
Oh, fantastic!
oh,
Yeah.
marvelous!
Yeah,
I can't read it, Laurel. What does it say? I can't read it.
Well, it's in French and English, but basically it says South Africa Women's Solidarity Day, August 9th. In French and English. So I'm mentioning this, I've got all my other stuff too. Everybody's got all these old ones.
Could I just interrupt briefly, Laurel, to ask you maybe to take a picture of those to allow us to put in our catalog?
And you've got a million of these, right?
Oh, those, yes. That's a nice one.
Jane wants one.
You know what, Jane? It's so humbling to have these things now that you can't wear because you're not the size you were when you were 20 or 30.
They've shrunk, I'm sure.
But yeah, they shrunk. I know it. Okay, I'll take the pictures. But there's two things, and this is, for me, this is both because of the political moment that like the way things transpired in South Africa, and also for some of us, the transition from CCU into the Canadian Auto Workers, and I began there at the local level in 1992, went to the national office in 94. There are two things I want to mention. One, there was a meeting, a very small little meeting, and Ken or Jane, I am sorry, I cannot remember who the other 5 people were. It was a very small group. It included Hassan Yusuf, and it was at the Westbury Hotel, and it was a breakfast meeting with a delegation, a SAC2 delegation, but by this point, it was electric because they had a electoral victory, and they were readying themselves to many of them personally to move from the labor movement into government positions. And of course, that was much debated, how many of them were leaving the labor movement and enticed and lured by government jobs. Not to demean those jobs, but hey, what about the labor movement? And I'm not sure everybody welcomed this particular comment, but I figured, okay, we're now at a stage where these guys are, we're at a different point. There's a coming of age now, and they're going to be subject to criticism and critiques about how many people go into government, et cetera. But a constant refrain for many of us, at least in the later years, was, where are the women? Where are the women delegates? And you got to get with the program, guys. And I'm sure you hear about this back home. Well, you're going to hear about it internationally now too. Anyway, that was, I'm not sure everybody welcomed that as my only contribution to the little breakfast discussion, but that was, there was another kind of pressure that needed to happen. Now, I don't remember the timing, but it had to be before 94, because by that time I moved into the national office. So I'm guessing 1993.
That's a good point, Laurel. I mean, because it shows, like, in the solidarity movement, we were, politicizing them as the same way as they were politicizing us.
Absolutely. And to me, this is like, welcome to the, this was, it just had so much meaning to be able to say this, as equals. That this is, now you have to take some leadership on this issue. But having said that, then in I'm guessing 93, when I was still at the CAW, there was a 2-year, very short transition period, had left the CTCU. And so we were at the local 40 office, and we were asked by CAW, and it might have been Hassan, CAW, but it might have been Hassan Yusuf, but to host at our local offices a delegation of women that were there from South African unions. Not by this point, I'm sure it was COSATU rather than SACTU. But we brought in, I mean, part of doing this was that it was easier, I think, for CAW National to organize it this way, is they knew that we would pull in people from other unions and from the Workers' Action Center and other community-based women's organizations. And we had a grand morning. It was such a wonderful exchange with these women from some different unions. I'm not saying that they're linked, but in my mind, they are, the kind of points that were made at the Westbury breakfast and the opportunity to actually host these women. And again, a sign of a developing maturity in that labor movement. And finally, just mention this is a little later in the transition with CAW, but we had one of the things that I did at CAW was, as part of my work, was organize a few roundtables on precarious work, which when it was still a newer issue. And we did a few, we used opportunities where the CAW had international delegations coming to visit to do roundtables that we, with those delegations on, specifically on what was happening with precarious work in South Africa or Denmark or et cetera. And we would pull in some leadership from the CAW and a few other unions. We actually had the sessions at the Ontario Federation of Labour building. Talk about full circle many moons later. And we would invite some of the other unions and the CLC and the OFL delegates to be there, as well as, again, some community organizations. So in September 2011, we had one of these roundtables with metal workers from NUMSA and had an exchange on precarious work and sort of compare and contrast what was happening here in Canada, or at least in the Ontario area, with what they were experiencing in various industries in South Africa. So for me, it's like there's a wonderful circle that has happened here that has brought us full circle to a point where we can have exchange as equals on issues of common concern.
Absolutely, and it's one of the concerns that we raise in our questioning of people when they're talking about the anti-apartheid movement. Was it hierarchical? Was it sexist? Was it racist? Or just even absence of those issues, sort of neglecting them rather than being racist, but neglecting BIPOC people as part of your organizational structure, and women's, of course, as a huge component. And thank goodness we've made some progress, I hope. Thanks for those comments. They're really amazing. Ken or Jane, have you got any other ideas here to throw out?
Go ahead, Jane. I think you had your hand up.
Well, just on that point about the various elements of solidarity that I don't think would have happened in the early 90s had it not been for all the work that activists in the CCU and in progressive affiliates of the CLC did to build that strong base and go from there. I know we had a number of delegations came to stay for 2-week sessions up in Port Elgin around occupational health and safety. Was one of the big issues for unions wanting to get more training in. Their politics were solid and way beyond ours for the most part, but some of the technical training around occupational health and safety they wanted. And interestingly enough, I read a PhD thesis, which was supposed to, I think it was University of Oxford, was supposed to be tracking the decline in solidarity from the 1990s on. And again, the lack of talking to trade unionists who were doing a lot of this exchange work over the years was stunning to me. I mean, they basically said the union movement kind of abandoned South Africa after 1990. And I'm thinking, what? I knew lots of things were going on. So there's these histories, these oral histories are so important to document.
And we saw to reinforce your comment there, we saw how so many militants from that period went on to continue their activism in so many other fields. And South African anti-apartheid was just built into their DNA as part of that process. So there's Hassan Yusuf now, or then at the time, president of the CLC. Well, that wasn't going to be possible back in the 1980s, that a chap from the Caribbean could get to that kind of place. Anyway, those are.
I just, if I just add a point, because with a mention of Hassan's name, I don't know, Jane, if you remember, but you introduced me to Hassan. We were waiting to pick up our luggage at an airport. I think it was in Vancouver, but we weren't going. And it was anyway, it was the time that Hassan was running to replace for the position of worker of color rep on the OFL. So this was right at the beginning of his, political, political career in the labor movement. So I was just struck at that. Maybe he can take us out for lunch at the Senate dining room or something.
I think we should descend and say,
if he still talks to people like us.
Oh, I'm sure he'll open the door if you knock. Don't worry.
As John Clark said it, we hope he gets seated in the class struggle section of the Senate.
Oh, that's a good line. I hadn't seen that.
I can't help but for the historical record here. I don't know if Guyana qualifies as a Caribbean country, but Hassan is from Guyana.
Yes, of course.
And they do include Guyana.
Do they?
Yes.
As part of the Caribbean Commonwealth.
Okay,
Yes.
so I learned something. Thank you.
I do recognize the difference, but anyway, folks, I mean, this has been amazing, and what a sweep of history, and what a fantastic analysis and approach of the various things. Any last words, please?
Well, I have a last word. It's been comment. Oh, Ken, I'll jump in first, because I think that, it needs to be underlined, the tremendous organizing skill of, Ken Lockhart, Ken Traina, Brenda, Jane in the SAC2 Solidarity Committee. I mean, it was exceptional. And, as union organizers, you note good organizers when you see one. And that in some ways made it, just easier and enjoyable to work with the SAC2 Solidarity Committee, because they were just such good organizers, had a plan, knew what they were doing, never left a stone unturned. And I learned a lot from all of them, just, in working with them. And so I wanted to say that, because you really did amazing work. Exceptional work.
Thank you for that, John. My kind of wrapping up comment would be to go back to where Laurell started in terms of the initial impression South Africa had for her, and the fact that Mandela at that time was considered a terrorist. Let's contrast that with the Amnesty report on Palestine last week. I mean, Amnesty in those days they couldn't endorse Mandela because he supported armed struggle. They simply could not name him as a prisoner of conscience. And so their position on South Africa was very poor for a long time. Of course, South Africans eventually changed that. But now last week or 2 weeks ago, they came out with a report condemning Israel as an apartheid state. So, I mean, things can change for the better over the course of time, and this is an example of it. But we did work in those days in the midst of the Cold War, and probably the most severe period of the Cold War. And that had a hell of a lot to do with our success as well as our failures. There were many failures as well. We didn't get into some doors. And it was because we were associated with SAC2, which was seen by the CLC as a communist union with politics, which was not allowed by the ICFTU. I mean, in 1959, the ICFTU went to South Africa and offered SACTU leaders when they were still above ground, 30,000 pounds if they would divorce themselves from the ANC. And SACTU said, thanks for lunch. We won't be talking about that anymore. So the politics were very heavy in the Cold War, and I think that had a lot to do with how we developed our work, the strategic importance of it, and working with people like Laurell and John was such a wonderful experience. The Harkers of this world, they're always going to be there. And we know that. I mean, I remember sitting in Lusaka, Zambia with George Larger from the Communication Workers. We were meeting with Thabo Mbeki, who would later become president of South Africa after Mandela died. So we're sitting having a meeting with Mbeki. He's telling us, based on what he's been told, is that if this SACTU committee would just disappear in Canada, the ANC would get all sorts of support from the labor movement that it isn't getting now. So, and that's based on information given to the ANC in Southern Africa by Harker and the CLC. It was a great opportunity for George and I, because I pulled out of my briefcase a letter which we had obtained, which showed that Harker said that ANC is nothing but a front for the Communist Party of South Africa. So I said to Becky, I said, is this the same John Harker that you're talking about? When he just accused you of being nothing but a front for the Communist Party of South Africa, and is telling you that if we get rid of the SACTU committee, CLC will be giving all sorts of resources to the ANC. Is this the same guy? And Becky put his pipe away and walked out of the room. So that's the kind of stuff we had to deal with. And it was fun. I mean, it was occasionally sad, but it was fun.
My goodness, what an amazing morning. I'm feeling exhilarated and enlightened. Just so much fun. Unless there's another, please, I'm free to talk, and talk is cheap on.
Well, if I talk any longer, it's good. I'm going to get into the weeds. Ken will remember the taped together $100 bill from the Kitimat Zoo.
I'm glad you mentioned
it. Special donation.
I'm glad you mentioned it.
Just to tell the story, Laurel.
Tell it, please. Wonderful.
Yeah. It's good.
It's a little embarrassing for anyway. I was invited out to Kitimat, center of so many stories. I was invited to their convention to talk about free trade, because we are involved in the fight against free trade. And Ken, remind me, I can't remember if it was you, but there was a speaker there. It was you, yeah, from the SACTU Solidarity to, give an update. I mean, you guys were ubiquitous at all the CCU and the conventions and CTCU and other affiliate for many years. We always had updates and requests for support, monetary where we had anything to give, and my union had peanuts to give, but our hearts were in it. Anyway, I was there for another reason, and I heard the report as did everybody else, and the guys gave some money and gave some support to SACTU Solidarity, and that evening, we went to the big local pub, known locally as the Zoo. And as I think is the want of guys who work in fairly remote areas by our standards anyways, and making bigger bucks than most people. And with not always a lot to do. There were drinking contests, and this was anyway, the idea was to up the ante each time. One guy would tear up a $5 bill, put it in the pint of beer and guzzle it, And
Jeepers.
it was, yeah. So let's just say me from at the time, I think my salary was something just above minimum wage, was pretty horrified. And I don't live in a frontier kind of town, so I was a naivete on this one. And anyway, when they got to the $100 bill, I drew the line and grabbed the pint glass and wouldn't let them drink it. Upended it on a serviette and kept all the pieces of this bill and said, "This is going to SAC2." And I took it back home. John remembers because he was in offices nearby, and I still had it on the serviette drying out. I put it together so that the what do you call it, the serial number, the numbers were all quite clear. Taped the thing together, took it to the little bank at the corner by our union office, and said I wanted to trade this in for a fresh $100 bill, and the serial numbers were obvious. And of course they said, "Where'd you get that?" And I said, I took great pleasure in this one. I said, "The animals at the zoo." Got it. And I sent it in this. I can't remember if I did it as the one. I think I did the fresh $100 bill, but whatever. I sent in $100 to the SAC2 office, and I said, "This is a donation from Kitimat." and Ken, understanding fully what had happened, said a very formal note, letter of thanks. The local union, I guess, in Kitimat, thanking them for this additional donation to the SAC2 Solidarity Campaign.
That's the kind of donation that's hard to make a sustaining donation.
Not without cirrhosis, anyway.
Anyway, let me just say that, I think for a lot of us, I know this is not just me, but like, in the big picture, you look back at your life and there's a few highlights. And I think for a lot of us, whether, just to be even on the edges, on the periphery, and that was not the case for people who are deeply involved on a day-to-day basis with the SAC2 Solidarity Committee. We were very fortunate. It was an honor, really, to even be at the edges of this in the fight against the horror that had unfolded in South Africa.
Wow, lovely bookends to the way you started and way you ended. Thank you so much, Laurel, and thank you again, John. If ever you can take a picture of your various souvenirs, please forward them to me and they'll be part of the archives. For that matter, well, okay, let me say goodbye and then we can have a chat after, okay? Then I can stop the recording and we're not building up this huge thing that I have to